Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Philippine maritime security. We're about to explore a nation of over 7,100 islands, a place where life is inherently intertwined with the sea. But this deep connection also brings immense challenges, especially in the hotly contested waters of the South China Sea. We've got some dense research and policy papers to unpack today, but I promise it's going to be fascinating.
You're absolutely right. When we talk about security, we often think about land borders and armies. But for the Philippines, the sea is where so much is at stake.
Exactly. It's not just about beautiful beaches and fishing boats. We're talking about a nation whose very survival and prosperity are tied to the ocean. So let's start with this. The Philippines is what's called an archipelagic state. What does that even mean? And why is it so important in this context?
It's a great question. And it's key to understanding everything that follows. Imagine drawing a line around the outermost points of the Philippines islands, instead of just having control over a narrow strip of water along the coast. An archipelagic state has sovereignty over all the waters within that line, connecting its islands into a single unit. It's like turning a bunch of scattered islands into one massive maritime territory.
Okay, I'm starting to see why that's a big deal. But didn't this concept face some pushback? I mean, giving a nation control over such a large expanse of ocean must have ruffled some feathers.
You're right. The Philippines, along with Indonesia, really had to fight for this concept to be recognized under international law. Before the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLS, many countries believed they had the right to sail freely through these archipelagic waters. But the Philippines argued that this would essentially cut their country into pieces, making it impossible to manage their resources or protect their security.
So winning that recognition under UNCLS must have been a massive victory for the Philippines.
Absolutely. It was a game changer. It gave them control over vital shipping lanes, fishing grounds, and potential resources like oil and gas. It also set a precedent for other archipelagic nations, strengthening their claims and shaping the entire landscape of maritime law.
That's fascinating. So we have the Philippines, this archipelagic nation at the heart of some of the world's busiest shipping routes. But there's a problem brewing, right? Enter the South China Sea, a body of water that seems to be generating more disputes than waves.
Unfortunately, you're right. And these disputes aren't just about historical claims or legal technicalities. They have real-world consequences for the Philippines' security economy and the lives of its people.
Okay, let's dive into the heart of the matter. What exactly are these disputes about, and who are the key players?
Imagine a map of the South China Sea with overlapping circles drawn by different countries. Each circle represents a claim to a portion of the sea, its resources, and the islands within it. You've got China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and of course the Philippines, all vying for control.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster, with everyone trying to grab a slice of the same pie. But are these claims just based on who can draw the biggest circle on a map? I mean, there must be some kind of legal framework, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? And that's where UNCLS, which we discussed earlier, comes back into play. It sets rules for how far a country's maritime zones extend from its coastline, how to delineate boundaries, and how to manage resources. But the problem is interpretation is everything.
So even with a rule book, there's room for disagreement, especially when you have countries with competing interests and historical claims.
Exactly. And to complicate matters further, China has this infamous 9-dash line that they claim encompasses most of the South China Sea. It's like drawing a giant ambiguous U shape that overlaps with the claims of almost everyone else.
Okay, that sounds pretty outrageous. How can they justify a claim that basically ignores everyone else's rights?
Well, China argues it's based on historical usage going back centuries, but most international legal experts say it has no basis under modern international law, especially UNCLS.
So we've got this volatile mix of overlapping claims, legal ambiguities, and a rising power like China asserting itself. What does all of this mean for the Philippines in terms of actual security threats? I mean, are we talking about the potential for actual conflict here?
The potential for conflict is a very real concern. Think about it. You have valuable resources like oil, gas, and fisheries at stake. You have vital shipping lanes that could be disrupted. And you have national pride and strategic interests fueling tensions.
That makes the South China Sea sound like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And there have been sparks, unfortunately. One of the most serious incidents was the 2012 standoff at Scarborough Shoal, a rich fishing ground claimed by both the Philippines and China. Chinese vessels blocked Filipino fishermen from accessing the area, and for weeks the two countries were locked in a tense standoff, raising fears of a military confrontation.
That must have been terrifying for the Filipino fishermen caught in the middle of this geopolitical chess match. So how did things de-escalate? Did one side back down?
While the Philippines eventually withdrew their vessels, but China effectively took control of Scarborough Shoal and has maintained a presence there ever since. It was a wake-up call for the Philippines, highlighting the stark reality of the power imbalance in the region.
Wow, so this isn't just a theoretical dispute playing out in courtrooms. It's having real-world impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. But we've been talking about external threats. What about internal security challenges? The Philippines is facing those too, right?
You're absolutely right. The Philippines has been grappling with internal conflicts, particularly Muslim separatist movements in the southern region of Mindanao, and this adds another layer of complexity to their maritime security concerns.
How so? I mean, how do these internal conflicts tie into the South China Sea disputes?
For one thing, these conflicts constrain the Philippines' resources and attention, making it even harder to focus on external threats. They also create potential vulnerabilities that external actors could exploit.
So you're saying that groups in the South China Sea could potentially take advantage of these internal divisions to advance their own interests?
It's a possibility that can't be ignored. There have been reports of links between some separatist groups and criminal networks involved in piracy and smuggling, and some analysts worry that external powers could try to influence or even support these groups to destabilize the region further.
That's a chilling thought. It sounds like the Philippines is facing a perfect storm of security challenges, both internal and external.
And we haven't even touched on the economic implications of these disputes yet. The South China Sea is not just a security concern, it's an economic lifeline for the Philippines.
Okay, let's shift gears then. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how these maritime disputes are impacting the Philippines' economy, and we'll dig into the complex web of foreign policy choices they're grappling with.
Stay tuned, because what happens in the South China Sea doesn't stay in the South China Sea. It ripples out, impacting global trade, regional stability, and the lives of millions.
Welcome back. We just explored how the South China Sea is shaping up to be a real security headache for the Philippines. But it's not just about military posturing or potential conflicts. This sea is also a treasure chest of resources. It's an economic lifeline for millions of Filipinos.
That's right. We're talking about a maritime area teeming with fish, potentially rich in oil and gas, and crisscrossed by vital shipping routes. The stakes are incredibly high, both for the Philippines and for the entire region.
Okay, so let's unpack the economic side of this equation. I know fishing is a huge part of life in the Philippines. How are these maritime disputes impacting that industry?
Imagine you're a Filipino fisherman who's been fishing in the same waters for generations. Suddenly, you find yourself facing harassment from foreign vessels, denied access to your traditional fishing grounds, or even risking detention by a foreign coast guard. This is the reality for many Filipinos who depend on the South China Sea for their livelihoods.
That's heartbreaking. It's one thing to talk about abstract disputes on a map, but it's another thing entirely when you see how it directly impacts people's lives and their ability to put food on the table.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual fishermen. The Philippines' entire fishing industry is under pressure. Overfishing, illegal fishing by foreign fleets, and damage to marine ecosystems are all taking a toll. This has serious implications for the country's food security and its economy.
So it's not just about who controls the waves.
Yeah.
It's about who controls the fish, and ultimately who controls the food supply. And what about the potential for oil and gas? I know there's been a lot of talk about untapped reserves in the South China Sea. How does that factor into the equation?
The South China Sea is believed to hold vast reserves of oil and gas. And for a country like the Philippines, which is heavily dependent on energy imports, that's a tantalizing prospect. The potential for energy independence, economic growth, and job creation is enormous.
But I imagine trying to tap into those resources in the middle of a territorial dispute is anything but easy.
You're absolutely right. Exploration and development become incredibly complex and risky in a contested environment. Companies are hesitant to invest when there's no guarantee of stability or legal certainty. And any attempt to drill for oil or gas could spark further tensions with China.
So it's like this huge potential windfall is sitting right there.
Yeah.
But the Philippines can't really access it without risking a major confrontation.
It's a classic dilemma, and it highlights the difficult choices facing the Philippines. Do they prioritize short-term economic gains, potentially at the risk of escalating tensions? Or do they focus on long-term stability and cooperation, even if it means delaying access to these resources?
It seems like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And speaking of difficult choices, let's talk about how the Philippines is trying to navigate this whole situation. They've got a long-standing alliance with the United States, but they also need to maintain good relations with China, a rising economic powerhouse, right on their doorstep.
Yeah.
How do they balance those competing interests?
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. On the one hand, the Philippines has this historic security alliance with the United States, formalized in the Mutual Defense Treaty. This treaty provides a degree of protection and acts as a deterrent against aggression.
So if things were to escalate with China, the Philippines could potentially call on the U.S. for support.
In theory, yes. But the treaty is not a blank check. It's subject to interpretation, and there are limits to what the U.S. is willing to do.
And I imagine relying too heavily on the U.S. could also backfire, potentially provoking China further.
Precisely. The Philippines doesn't want to become a pawn in a larger geopolitical game between the U.S. and China, so they're also actively pursuing diplomacy and cooperation both bilaterally with China and through regional mechanisms like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
So it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yep.
Leverage the U.S. alliance for security, engage with China diplomatically, and work with regional partners to try to find common ground.
Exactly. But let's not forget that the Philippines has its own agency in this situation. They're not simply reacting to external pressures. They're also taking steps to strengthen their own position and assert their rights.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one key development was the 2009 Philippine Baselines Law. This law aimed to clarify the country's maritime boundaries and bring them into compliance with INCLS. But it also involves some strategic decisions about how to define those boundaries.
Right, remind me. We talked earlier about how INCLS recognizes the concept of an archipelagic state, which gives the Philippines control over a vast area of water. But didn't we also say that there were disputes about how to draw the lines around those outermost points?
You've got a great memory. And that's precisely where the 2009 law comes in. The Philippines had to decide how to classify certain features, particularly the Calayan Island Group and Scarborough Shoal. These areas are claimed by several countries, including China, and how they were categorized would have a major impact on the Philippines' maritime claims.
Okay, so walk me through the options. What were the different ways they could have approached this?
They could have opted for a maximalist approach, basically drawing a single baseline around all the disputed features, claiming them as part of the main archipelago. This would have given them a larger exclusive economic zone and potentially more control over resources.
But I imagine that would have also been incredibly provocative.
Yeah,
Essentially saying, we're claiming everything and we don't care what anyone else thinks.
exactly. It would have been a bold, some might say reckless move that could have triggered a major backlash from China and other claimants. So the Philippines opted for a more nuanced approach, classifying the Calayan Island Group and Scarborough Shoal as a regime of islands.
Okay, regime of violence. Explain that one to me. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Essentially, it means that these features are treated as individual islands with their own maritime zones,
Yeah.
rather than being lumped together with the main archipelago.
So instead of drawing one giant circle around everything, you're drawing smaller circles around these specific areas.
A perfect analogy. And this decision had significant implications. It allowed the Philippines to claim a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around each of these features, even though they're located far from the main archipelago.
I see. So it's a way of maximizing their maritime claims without being overly aggressive and provoking a major confrontation.
Exactly. It's a strategic move that attempts to balance asserting their rights under international law with the realities of the power dynamics in the region.
But didn't this decision also spark some controversy? I mean, I imagine some people within the Philippines felt like they were giving up potential claims by not taking the maximalist approach.
You're absolutely right. There were critics who argued that the regime of islands approach was too cautious, that it ceded ground to China, and that it weakened the Philippines' position in the long run.
So even within the Philippines, there's a debate about how assertive they should be in pursuing their claims. It seems like they're walking a tightrope, trying to find that sweet spot between standing up for their rights and avoiding a dangerous escalation with a much more powerful neighbor.
And that tension, that balancing act, is at the heart of the Philippines' maritime security dilemma. They're trying to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape where the rules are often unclear, the stakes are incredibly high, and the outcome is anything but certain.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered a lot of ground, from the economic significance of the South China Sea to the strategic considerations behind the Philippines' actions. But as we've seen, the situation is constantly evolving.
And there are even more twists and turns ahead. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the most recent developments, including China's island-building campaign, the Philippines' legal victory against China's 9-dash-line claim, and the potential paths forward for this nation at the crossroads of maritime power.
Don't go anywhere. This journey through the turbulent waters of the South China Sea isn't over yet. We've got more to uncover and more to analyze as we delve deeper into the complexities of Philippine maritime security. Welcome back to our deep dive into Philippine maritime security. We've established that the South China Sea is vital to the Philippines' survival, not just economically, but for its very security as a nation. We've also seen how China's growing assertiveness is throwing a wrench into things. So where do we go from here? What are the Philippines' options in this high-stakes game?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, unfortunately, isn't a simple one. The Philippines is facing a real dilemma, a classic David and Goliath situation.
Okay, so let's break down those options. What's on the table? What are the different paths the Philippines could take?
One option is to double down on the legal front. Remember that 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the one that basically invalidated China's expansive nine-dash-line claim?
Yeah, that was a huge win for the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
A victory for international law.
It was a significant victory, no doubt. It affirmed the Philippines' rights under UNCLS and sent a clear message that China's claims were excessive and lacked a legal basis.
So problem solved, right? Case closed.
If only it were that simple. The problem is that China has refused to recognize the ruling. They've basically ignored it, calling it null and void.
So we're back to the issue of enforcement. What good is a legal victory if the other side simply refuses to play by the rules?
Precisely. And that's the challenge with international law. It relies on countries voluntarily complying with rulings and respecting international norms. And when a powerful country like China decides to go its own way, there's not much the Philippines can do to force them to comply.
So what's the point of pursuing the legal route if it's essentially toothless?
It's not entirely pointless. The ruling still carries weight in the international community. It helps to delegitimize China's claims and rally support for the Philippines' position. It also strengthens their hand in diplomatic negotiations and provides a basis for future legal action if necessary.
Okay, so it's more about winning the battle of public opinion and building international pressure rather than expecting China to suddenly change course.
Exactly. It's a long game and it's not a guaranteed win, but it's one of the tools the Philippines has at its disposal.
So what other options are there? I mean, if international law alone can't protect them, surely they need to do more to defend themselves, right?
That brings us to the second option, strengthening the Philippines' own defense capabilities. This means investing in their Navy and Coast Guard, upgrading equipment and improving training to better monitor and protect their waters.
But let's be realistic. Can the Philippines, even with a military buildup, realistically match China's might? We're talking about a superpower with a rapidly growing Navy and a vast arsenal of weapons. It seems like a David and Goliath situation no matter how you slice it.
You're right. Trying to outspend and outgun China would be a fool's errand. But that doesn't mean the Philippines is powerless. Remember the concept of asymmetric warfare. It's not about matching your opponent blow for blow. It's about finding creative ways to exploit their weaknesses and make any aggression too costly to contemplate.
So instead of trying to build a fleet of aircraft carriers, the focus could be on more nimble, cost-effective strategies.
Exactly. Think about coastal defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and utilizing intelligence and surveillance to maximize their limited resources. It's about making it clear to China that any attempt to encroach on their territory will be met with fierce resistance, even if it's not a symmetrical fight.
So it's about raising the stakes, making the potential costs of aggression outweigh the benefits for China.
Precisely. And that's where the U.S. alliance comes back into play. Even if the U.S. doesn't directly intervene in every dispute, their presence in the region, their military exercises with the Philippines, and their commitment to freedom of navigation act as a deterrent. It sends a signal to China that they can't just bully their way around the South China Sea without consequences.
Okay, so we have the legal track, the military buildup, and the U.S. alliance. What other avenues are there for the Philippines to pursue?
One of the most important tools in their arsenal is diplomacy. And this means engaging on multiple fronts, bilaterally with China, through regional organizations like ASEAN, and by building coalitions with other countries that share their concerns about China's behavior.
I can see how working with other Southeast Asian nations through ASEAN would be crucial. There's strength in numbers, right?
Absolutely. A united front is much more powerful than any one country going it alone. ASEAN has been trying to negotiate a code of conduct with China for years, a set of rules to manage behavior in the South China Sea and prevent incidents from escalating into conflict.
So it's about finding ways to cooperate, even amidst these disputes, to establish some ground rules and prevent things from spiraling out of control.
Exactly. And it's not just about containing China. It's also about finding ways to work together on issues of common interest, like fisheries management, environmental protection, and search and rescue operations.
Because at the end of the day, everyone benefits from a stable and prosperous South China Sea, right?
Precisely. And that brings us to another intriguing option, the development of a blue economy in the region.
Okay, blue economy.
Yeah.
That sounds intriguing. What exactly does that entail?
Think of it as a way of sustainably utilizing the ocean's resources for economic growth. We're talking about everything from sustainable fishing and aquaculture to renewable energy tourism and even biotechnology.
So it's about shifting the focus away from just extracting resources like oil and gas and towards more holistic, sustainable approach to managing the ocean's bounty.
Exactly. And the Philippines has a lot of potential in this area. They have a vast coastline, abundant marine resources, and a growing tourism industry.
But I imagine developing a blue economy in the middle of a territorial dispute is no easy feat.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. By promoting a blue economy, the Philippines can strengthen its own position, build partnerships with other countries, and potentially even find common ground with China.
It's like flipping the script, turning a source of conflict into a catalyst for cooperation. I love that idea.
And it ties into the whole concept of human security that we touched on earlier. It's not just about protecting national borders. It's about protecting people's livelihoods, ensuring their access to resources, and building a future where everyone can thrive.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Philippine maritime security, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be pondering as they navigate this complex world?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the future of the South China Sea is not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices that countries make, by the actions of leaders, and by the engagement of everyday citizens.
So what happens in the South China Sea matters. And even though the Philippines faces an uphill battle, they have a vital role to play in shaping a future where cooperation, not conflict, prevails.
Absolutely. And with that, I encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating dynamic region. Read up on the incidents we've discussed, delve into the legal arguments, and stay informed about the ongoing developments. The South China Sea deserves our attention because what happens there matters to the Philippines, to the region, and to the world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a better understanding of the complex challenges and opportunities facing the Philippines in the South China Sea. Until next time, keep exploring and